Olá, boa tarde. Nós vamos vamos dar início à primeira conferência do ciclo, do conjunto de conferências que estão integradas no programa do Index 2022. I'll switch to English because this session, this first talk and debate will be in English. Just a very, very brief words of presentation and thanking Delfina and Virginia for having accepting our invitation to be here, and also to you. Some of you were here yesterday, and we spoke a little bit in the presentation of the Biennale that this relationship between art and technology was thought within an ecological perspective, and we'll see during this during all these debates that we'll present in the festival, both presential and online, how this will develop. And today we start with this question, that is, what is the power of imagination and design in dark times? And we'll see what it means to put this question today. And we have Delfina Fantini van Ditmar, who is a design researcher and a lecturer at the Royal College of Art, a senior lecturer. She changed recently. And she has quite a transdisciplinary background. Her first studies were in biology, and this is not something I think that perhaps in the end I would like to speak a little bit about this. And now she makes connections with and linking design research, critical algorithmic studies, architecture and ecology. Thank you very much, Delfina, for being here. And Virginia Tassinari, who is online. Due to health reasons, she could not travel. So thank you very much, Virginia, for being here with us, even online. We hope that in the future you can have your real presence here. Virginia's work connects philosophy and also design research. And she researched how philosophy can contribute to the contemporary design research discourse. She's a researcher and a lecturer at Politecnico di Milano within the Polimi Desis Lab, and she also teaches at Lucca School of Arts, and she's also a visiting scholar at the Parsons, the New School of Design in New York. The base or the starting point of this invitation is in a book that she co-organized, Designing in Dark Times, an Arenditian Lexicon. Sorry, the word was not coming. So I will give the word to Virginia, first of all, and I'll be back just to explain a little bit how it will work. Virginia and Delfina will start, and I'll be back to moderate a short discussion with you, with the public. So please feel free to take notes and then share your comments, questions, and everything. So thank you. You can start, Virginia.
Thank you, Liliana. Thank you very much for this invitation. I think now Delfina is probably putting the screen online so that I can also see it from the Zoom link. I'm very glad to be able to have this conversation together this evening. So again, thank you very much for guesting me and also guesting me online. Giving me this opportunity. So this presentation really was put together like it's a discourse that we are developing with Delfina this evening. And it's also a discourse that somehow started for me a few years ago, starting working on this book. which is called Designing in Dark Times, an Arenditian Lexicon. I also find it difficult to say Arenditian, so Liliana, don't worry. And the idea behind it's to really look into Hannah Arendt's philosophy and to look into ways in which the philosophy of Hannah Arendt can still be meaningful for designing today. I've been working on this volume together with Eduardo Starkowski, who's the co-editor with me of the book. And Clive Wilnot has also been quite pivotal in a role of taking shape of the conversation that brought to the book. I must say the book is also sort of living project in the sense that we are continuing working on that. We're continuing researching on those topics, and also we are continuing writing together. And so what I will share today, it's also some thoughts that are still like in the making, in the process. And starting really from Arendt and Arendt's idea of dark times, because it was really in the title. Basically, dark time, when we came out with the book, but also with when Eduardo and Clive came out with the book series Designing in Dark Time, there was also a bit of concern about the stress on dark times. Like why should we call them dark? Are those really dark, the time in which we are in? I must say, after a few years, unluckily, it's still very contemporary to talk about dark times, but I really want to go deeper into this concept, and we'll see perhaps it's not so dark as it seemed. So basically, Hannah Arendt says the dark time has to do with the disconnect with the political realm, with the public realm. And basically, the disconnect has to do with many different things. According to Arendt, in looking at the Western culture and Western societies, this happened mostly because politics became like a work. It became something that has to do with representative politicians, right, that represent our points of view. And this creates a sort of detachment so that people more and more look into their own private interest instead of looking into the common interest and the common realm as such. And this political disconnect and of this untrust towards politics, it's something which is really problematic to her. And actually, this is what creates the dark times, right? The times in which we no longer believe in a common word that we all contribute to constitute. And when we do that, this is essentially, according to Arendt, because of one specific reason. And the fact is that we are basically all connected to one another. We are all related to one another. And when we do not recognize this, we start to look into our own matters. We start to look into our own interest. So the word in between, it's really key to her, because the in between, it's what is in between us. So the common real is really what binds us together. This in between, it's something that relates all of us together. And when we stop seeing that, when we stop recognizing that, there is really a problem there happening in society. So Hannah Arendt takes this concept of in-between and brings it back to the Latin roots, which is the word inter esse, which is literally being amongst others. And to her, it's more complex to explain how those two words are related, but for Neo-Latin languages, so for Italian speaker, Spanish speaker, and Portuguese speaker, so for the three of us this evening, Delfina and Liliana, it's rather intuitive to see that the interest, it's really what binds us together. So the word interest has been the word of this English word interest. So when actually we look into interest, the connotation that we have when we use the word interest, we immediately think about private interest, right? We think about, being looking only at your things and not caring about the commons. But actually, Hannah Arendt says the common interest is really the horizon for private interest. So the private interest cannot thrive if not thought from within the context of common interest. That makes the two being very related. Once we choose to look into common interest, at the end of the day, we also choose to look towards our own private interest. But this is not so evident, right? And that's why we get tricked there. That's why we choose to do that. And actually, when we recognize those common interests as being the horizon from which our own private interests thrive, we actually develop a common operation of thinking. We actually really think in political terms. We are able to think in a dialogical way with other people and enter in conversation with other people on those common interests binding us together. When we do that, those thoughts can be translated into action, have the power to be translated into actions, which are actually political actions. So there are actions that can really change the way in which we construct together a common word. The problem is that this idea of the political being a common constitution of the common real actually kind of disappears in dark time, because again, we do not acknowledge this intimate link between the private and the public interest, and because we just look into our own private interest. And of course, this is a misconception. This is a mistake. And this is actually the terrible mistake that has characterized the last 2,000 years of European history. So Hannah Arendt describes this process being really like changing society, creating the disconnect towards politics, and basically undermine the possibility for real thought and real action. So she says, when we speak about thought, and we do not think of thought within this landscape of the political, actually we are not really thinking, right? To think, it takes other people, it takes dialogue, it takes being able to exchange thought with others on the common goods. So we actually think we know what thought and action are, but actually we just have a very kind of deteriorated version of what thought and action are. And that's why Hannah Arendt thinks that thoughtfulness, so the lack of thought, is what characterizes our contemporaneity. And that's why we encounter so many different forms of totalitarianism in our contemporaneity, because we miss or we lack the ability to really think and therefore to really act in a political way. So, of course, what about today? I know that the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, some years ago, became again one of the bestsellers, for instance, in America. So there was a lot of attention on totalitarianism, and I think there still is, because indeed we are experiencing dark times, and we are experiencing dark times in many different places of the world, and this takes different meanings in the different places from where we stand. So I think indeed we are still in dark times, and this image, I know this is not, like very dramatic as an image probably to you, but it is very dramatic to me because this is about my city. And this is about an idea of dark time that is more global, if I may say, if I may use this word, which I normally don't like. It's more a kind of dark time that, binds us all together, which is what we identify with the word Anthropocene. So this kind of scenario in my mind, as I was living in Venice 25 years ago, this could be something, like that perhaps the children of my children would have witnessed. But sadly, this is something that happened just a few years ago, that, this traghetto boat, went against one of those palaces in the Canal Grande just because of this high water rising because of the climate change. And we know that climate change has many different catastrophic kind of manifestations, right? And ways of this being destructive towards the human. So we see the fact that we did not acknowledge in the past how we are connected to the common good somehow, and we only looked to gain more money and to create a more rich society, had this kind of consequences already now. And of course, there are other kinds of consequences that perhaps are not always acknowledged, which are, for instance, the environmental and social kind of injustices that are created because of climate change, such as, for instance, climate migration. These are really dramatic, realities that we all know about, but it's not always evident to take account for it and take responsibility for it. Who is responsible for that, and what can we do to react to this situation, to face the Anthropocene? So basically, indeed, Hannah Arendt was talking about the link between private interest and common interest, but there was one level of the conversation that she wasn't touching yet, and not because this wasn't already present, but because the consequences of this weren't present yet, or not present yet in the dramatic way that we are encountering now. And basically the fact that not only our private interests are connected to the common interest, but also connected to the more than human common interest. So basically the interest of the planet are connected to the interest of the human and to the private interest of each of us. Bruno Latour speaks about Trumpism, and he says that Trumpism is the inability to recognize that the effects of climate change are already present now, and that we are already facing those consequences now. And I think this great acceleration, or the new climate regime, as Bruno Latour describes, is really confronting us with the fact that we lost this link, this connection that binds humans to the environment and to more than human agents. So basically, we do not have in this moment really the ability to think and act, because we do not recognize also those more than human common interests, and we do not recognize, therefore, the cosmopolitical dimension of human politics. So the fact that human politics cannot strive if the cosmopolitics does not strive. So basically the politics seen from this perspective of more than human agents, so seen from the perspective of how humans are deeply entangled to other kinds of agents, together composing the earth we are inhabiting. And again, this is a very, relevant discussion, but you could wonder, yes, okay, those are things we know about, but what does have this to do with design, with us as being designers, as being people creating something? And I think, indeed, it's what I would like to address now, to see what can we do and what have we been doing in the past. What is our responsibility, and what has been our responsibility in the past? So. Indeed, if we look at design, and if we look at design from the perspective of history of design, somehow design is a project that somehow started with the modern, right? And so with this idea of time as being something linear, and being design as being a way to project yourself towards the future. Even the word progetto, or the word project, right, or progetto in Italian, it takes into the word this fact of going towards the future, right? To go towards the future in a way in which you think that future is a sort of continuation of the past. But by doing so, the kind of epistemological framework that you're using is really like this idea of linear idea of time, of idea of production, of consumption. And this kind of design is really the futuring, as also Tony Fry helped us to articulate. So like when you saw this image of this bird with all this plastic inside the belly, someone has been designing those flacons, those bottles. And it's not that this person is an evil person, but there are evil consequences for these design choices, which is if design is only seen as a sort of way to imagine a project of modernity by creating tools and creating products that service to a certain idea of progress, then of course we are part of this story, and we are responsible or co-responsible for, indeed, the Anthropocene, the situation in which we are today. And yet, what should we then do? Because I think the temptation is really big to say, okay, perhaps we shouldn't design anymore. Perhaps we should, like cease our work. We should do something else in life, because anything we do, it's again, a product which is put in the market, or a product which is produced and consumed. And actually, what we would like to explore today, also with Delfina, is the fact that perhaps there is something that we can do. And going back to Hannah Arendt, Hannah Arendt can help us in this, because I was mentioning at the beginning that there is a sort of ambiguity in the idea of dark times in Hannah Arendt, because on the one side, indeed, it has to do with the detachment to from the political, but on the other side, in dark times, there are things that might happen. Dark time is a moment of deep possibilities, of transformation. It's a moment in which we can become aware of something and change our path. And so if we look from this perspective, perhaps designing in dark times has a potential, has a challenge, as a chance, right? And this is a quote that Hannah Arendt particularly loves. It's a quote from Hölderlin that says, "When the danger grows the saving power also." And this was a quote that fascinated many philosophers in the 20th century. Martin Heidegger also worked on this. Walter Benjamin worked on this, just to provide you some small examples. But in the way in which Hannah Arendt looked at this quote, it's kind of very peculiar. And so I would like now to very briefly introduce the way in which she uses this idea of the saving as possible being in dark times. And if we go back into this idea of linear time, what basically happens when we experience dark time is that we experience a moment of disbelief of a certain kind of epistemological paradigm. So we no longer believe in linear time. We no longer believe in this idea of micro-narratives. And we kind of have the ability, Delfina, if you just go quickly to the previous slide so that I can exemplify what I mean. So you see here, there is a crack, right? There is something which is broken. And this moment of disbelief, it is a moment also of disillusion of the tradition and the values that we received from the tradition, which in this case are anthropocentric values. And it's a moment in which we kind of feel lost, right? We feel like we don't know what to do. It's a moment in which we experience a gap into time. And this gap into time, according to Hannah Arendt, provides us with the possibility to go to a deeper understanding of time, of an alternative understanding of time, and a different understanding of a different way of engage with reality. So not in a dichotomic way, not in a universalized way, and to engage with new ways of thinking. And this is also a moment when we are finally able to act. And Hannah Arendt says this is a sort of miracle, actually, that, in this deep moment of disillusion, in this deep moment of disorientation, we are actually able to find an alternative. And this is the new beginning that that Hannah Arendt talks about in the next slides, when she talks about the possibility to start something new. So Hannah Arendt says the word arcane, which is this Greek word from which the begins comes from, actually in Latin it's translated as agere, which means to act. So this is really like the essence of the ability of act, to be able to jump out of a situation and to step beyond this principle of necessity that makes the future exactly the same as the present or the past, as its prolongation, a prolongation of the value of the past, a prolongation of the expectation of the past. We need to break this pattern, this anthropocentric pattern. And I think Hannah Arendt can help us to understand that we can do something, we can act, we can engage with new beginnings. And this is, in the next slide, you just see the word new, because this is actually what Hannah Arendt invites us to do, to engage with the new, with the totally new. The new beginnings to her is the infinite improbability that occurs regularly. So something which is basically impossible and yet happens. That's why she also talks about nativity. And she talks about newborn. And she says, newborn are always a miracle, right? And so we can always imagine an action to be possible. And when we engage with action, we actually, or when we are able to step out of this gap, of this belief, and to see alternatives, we actually kind of illuminate the present. We can become sort of weak lights that are able to illuminate the present. And of course, this is not, like a sort of electric light. It's more like a fireflies kind of light, which is intermittent, right? It goes and goes away. It's something that it's probably not 100% in our hand, but we can do it, because this is the marvelous thing also of being human. Right? We can be anthropocentric, but there's also something good in being human, that we can jump out of the situation and we can engage with new beginnings. So how can we illuminate the reality? How can we be those kind of weak lights that illuminates the present? So I think the act of designing can be this kind of activity of thought that makes it possible. And that's why common interests are so relevant. And that's why it's so important to recognize also the connection between human and more than human common interests, and to recognize this cosmopolitical dimension, because once we recognize those common interests as really binding us together, as really being, like the radical interdependence that Arturo Escobar talks about, is really this ability to recognize that we all interdepend from one another. And once we recognize this, we are empowered to act. We are empowered to think with other people. We are empowered to step out of that situation and to really engage with something totally new. And that's what we hope that we, as designers, can also do. So if we just tap a few slides ahead. Okay, so actually this is really like this idea of radical interdependence. It's really something that helped me a lot to also make sense of Hannah Arendt's thinking, also if you want beyond our own intention, because we know Hannah Arendt didn't speak about more than humans. But I think the sensitivity we have found today, if we visit back her work, can help us to have this dimension to her work, and to see how it's important to recognize those deep relationality connecting all us and binding all us together, and recognize this as a form of cosmopolitics, so opening up the idea of politics towards more than human agents. So we can perhaps move forward to this next slide. I think probably, Delfina, now it's your part of the story.
So I think a very good framing for this context in design, I'm coming from design education, is this common understanding of we live among toxicity. And this is a byproduct of our society, and it belongs to all of us. You can produce it here, but you have no idea where would it end. And clearly, what you produce in one part affecting the other. So whenever I start speaking about ecology, I always bring this concept from researcher Susan Schubli. She belongs to forensic architecture. But this is the common ground that we are at the moment. So I think to start talking about new beginnings, it's really important to address the situation in which we are. And since the topic of index is surface, I think it's interesting to see some discourses coming from design in relation to the degeneration in which we're living on. So I have a couple of quotes of Anthony Fry, which Virginia briefly mentioned. Designers must be aware of the complex equation of creation and destruction that is vast and complex. It's definitely not a topic that is easy to approach, and whenever you teach, this is where students have been thinking, but it paralyzed them because it's too big to approach. So yes, it is vast, it is complex, but we need to put this into equation. It's not like in GDP, where you can completely, forever, keep ignoring what you destroy in terms of what you gain and produce. In the creative discourse, what we destroy often goes unseen. Destruction is omnipresent as creativity prevails in the discourse. Design is often at the back of destructive industries. We have been used to this instrumental myopia without a critical moment of interrogation, without a comprehension what is being futured and what is being defutured as a consequence of what we throw into the world. This results in a context that I really like to use also, is coming from Anna Tsing, and is the concept of the capitalist ruin. This is a setting of environmental degradation and economic alienation, recognizing that progress stories have developed in the context of blasted landscape. In this book, through the figure of the Matsuke mushroom, she encourages us to open our imagination and rethink how we can live in this collective home over this capitalist ruin. I really encourage you to read the book. It's really beautiful, easy to read, and it's an optimistic book because she points out how can we coexist within this environmental disruption. Design is really important in this context. We live in a world that is made of design, and design is omnipresent. I mean, just look around where we are. I have a computer in front, I have 10 wires, a phone, a table, a screen, a speaker, and a fountain. So yes, we are surrounded by design. But also, quoting again Arturo Escobar, which are also two references that myself and Virginia will bring often into the discussion, design also could structure possibilities of existing into the world if you frame it with the right lens. And in a couple of slides, I will go into some design lenses that I think are relevant to talk about. But for this, I think also coming from an education perspective, it's really important, as Richard Serra says, to cut through the weight of our own educations. In my case, I receive students that study industrial design, which is nothing but helping out to destroy the world with no questioning. So the first thing I have to do, I teach in a master level, is to make them unlearn, show them new frameworks, and let them experiment in a new way of rethinking about the world. But this step, I think it's really important. So design has a responsibility, and this is something that with my welcome pack to the course, is you're not only accountable for innovative solutions, but also you're very much part of the environmental collapse. And the fact that you evade these ecological implications, you are complicit. So yeah, the urgency of this moment really requires a diverse series of responses from very different approaches and at various scales. This is a time to be propositional, to problematize deep-rooted issues, and also to find steps forward, as Virginia was taking us through her reading of Hannah Arendt. And very importantly, and going back to the unlearning, the knowledge and the ability to industrialize the planet are very much not the same to the ones we need to heal it. So now I'm going to briefly mention some theoretical lenses that are going to open up some possibilities. And for this, we don't need a technological fix. It's actually much more about epistemologies and ontologies into design discussion. I'm going to bring back the topic of defuturing. So Tony Fry suggests that what you create embeds some destruction that actually has to be acknowledged in the design process. This doesn't mean that destruction cannot be mitigated, but we really need to think about it. So Tony Fry brings temporality as a matter of preoccupations and make designers project themselves into the future and design back from it to the present once they see the horror that they have in front of them. Another important design theorist is Ezio Mancini. In his book, Politics of the Everyday, he stressed that we need to move outside the mainstream models of living. So another educational tool that I think it's really important to address is we need to re-envision different lifestyles. And this is not easy. As he say, with this transition, you will always commit mistakes and you will be living within contradictions. But we really need to learn differently. So it's not an easy step, but I don't think we can get out of this environmental crisis without rethinking how we live. And now going back to Arturo Escobar, he proposes two concepts that I think they're core. One is the pluriverse. And with the pluriverse, what he means is we need a world where many worlds fit, giving space for these alternative ways that they are being constructed. This means we need to get away of this universal one world vision. And he especially mentioned the Eurocentric vision of design. And then he also proposed the model of this autonomous designer, which means as a future designer, you should definitely abstain from commercial progress, aiming for place-based and collaborative approaches. So he stressed that as a designer, it's extremely important that you keep questioning the environment, politics, and more than anything, really focusing all of these interdependencies of all human beings. Another interesting framework came out in a book published 2 years ago. It's from Ron Wakari. It's called For More Than Human-Centered Worlds. He claims that to design has to rethink different ways that humans and non-humans are bounded together materially, ethically, and existentially. He speaks about the expanded agency of the designer, in which non-humans contribute as a creative actor in the design and also are a design force, so really including them in our design processes. And then he speaks about the human role as someone that convenes and maintains the collective speaking on behalf of the participation of non-humans. And to summarize his thinking, designers should be plural, heterogeneous, and differentiated actors. This also resonates a lot with the decolonizing design framework. We should decenter the human and de-emphasize the role of the humans. So we have the responsibility to illuminate the existence of the other and bring them on our projects. And this should be seen not as a privileged force in design, but as a unique member of an expanded, agentic human, non-human assembly that together we design. So this is a very simple but very nice illustration of how we've been doing things and how we actually need to start designing and thinking of things. Another aspect that I think it's interesting to mention is Julia Watson's low-tech, an idea of radical indigenism. In her book, she mentioned that now we're in a crossroad where either we keep living with this narrow view of technology informed very much from this fake distance that we have with nature, or we can acknowledge that that is just one way of seeing things, but actually we can learn a lot from living closer to nature, but also going back to the way that indigenous people live with nature. In her book, she claims, while we're drowning in this age of information, we're starving of wisdom. While modern societies were trying to conquer nature in the name of progress, indigenous were working with it. So low-tech is a movement that investigates traditional ecological knowledge, cultural practice offering a new path to shrink this ecological footprint. She proposes tech, traditional ecological network, which is engineered to sustain, not to exploit resources, fostering symbiosis between species, making biodiversity the building block used to construct green technologies. Just to give you like a little example, but I think it's quite simple and very beautiful. These are some dams created by this indigenous tribe in Watiwina dams. How they constructed the dams is intergenerational, and there's a two-phase construction. First is the dam making. The young people form a weir across the river using timber, bark, and lianas from the forest. And then the elderly people construct nets of barks and vine to catch up these jumping fish. So yeah, they construct this, they make these baskets, and afterward they're attached to the lower sections of the dam to slow the water. And once the season is over, they make sure to remove all these dams, so then fish can go up the river and spawn. So there's an understanding of cycles, there's an understanding where can we place it, and also there's a very clever way of making with what you have around. So as you can see in this image, you have a brutal impact concrete dam, which is what they mostly do for hydroelectrics. And in contrast, you have this very porous seasonal and temporal dam. And in her book, she gives many examples, shedding light into potential more natural, ancestral, but so wise solutions. And this, obviously, we cannot replicate what we did back then. The world has changed, but we can learn a lot. And one example is the future of microdamming. I also like this view from Emanuele Quins, which is, in design, we now should start thinking in geological scales. We are in the Anthropocene, so we're forced to move to another geological scales. And this means we have to get out of our human temporality. So we need to start thinking on a non-human scale. And now we reach, I think, one of the most relevant discussions, frameworks, and topics, which is regenerative design. Regenerative design is based in the idea that the level of toxicity and damage that we have done, we cannot keep using the concept of sustainability. Not doing enough bad is not enough. The crisis is such that we need to aim to provide health for ecosystems. So we need to find ways to contribute, accelerate its renewal, and we need to give back much more than what we take, because the state is really catastrophic. And here I'm going to mention some quotes. I actually was speaking with Daniel Christian Val this week, and it was extremely enlightening. And I think for students in design, it's very important that you hear his thoughts. He claims that the Western world is very object-centered and built on this fake metaphor of culture and nature as a separate things. We should be thinking in objects, but in the interconnection of them and in their long-term capacity. It's really time to reconnect with this earth wisdom. And then I asked, what do you think designers should be thinking? So he gave an example of someone making an airport, so he even found the most interesting example. But at the end, he said, no matter where you are or in which situation you are, you can definitely see how do you fit in providing a life-sustaining project. And when I talked to him, he always came back to the idea of localism. To understand what's the problem and what people need, you really need to work in small scale. And obviously, the only way to get out of here is a shift in value making. That's the only way of a paradigm shift. I also want to mention Donna Haraway and her idea of staying with the trouble. She's another huge exponent of the idea and the relevance of the human and non-human inextricability. And she says we need sympoiesis, which is making with this other. She also mentioned that this is a trackless territory, meaning that there's no toolkit or guide of best practice to formulate how to live with them. So this is also something that I usually tell to my students. This is a field that you really need to start creating. We have all these amazing theoreticals, we do have examples, but it's a field that really has to prosper. And the other message that Anna Arendt leaves us is we have to stay with this trouble. These times are with various problems and they're difficult to grasp in thought, but we cannot postpone things for later because it's too hyper-complex, and we should definitely abandon this idea of this uncritical post-enlightenment idea that technoscience will fix it all. And I think that takes us to this concept of techno-solutionism that I think is so useful also in design, because whenever you teach designers, a lot of them come with the idea technology will solve it all. A sensor, we could see how we pollute, or we do this little machine to extract pollution, and then I don't need to change anything, and I don't need to give up my comfort, and I don't need to rethink basically the main issues that are causing all of this. So Evgeny Morozov defines this as a tendency to quickly solve a no problem or a complex situation with a technological solution. And I think here Shannon Mattern, who is in the New School, really speaks that these techno solutions are reductive and they easily lead to quantity and precise measures of program, which makes absolutely no sense for the problem. By students or designers, and not to mention industries, with this idea of techno-fix, which are not only reductive, but they're coming with a significant environmental cost. Again, this relates to surface, and I think it's being very much explored next to us in the exhibition, but it's this addiction to lithium battery, which is increasing exponentially. And it's extremely damaging, not only in terms of how it pollutes the earth, but also how it's affecting the surrounding communities and bringing back the topic, affecting so many species that are around. So here I have a Tesla, which has about 12 kilograms of lithium in it. So this is what politicians are guiding us, electric cars. However, here where we are very close to the mines, and we can understand that this Tesla and this fantasy of the electric brings with it a lot of social injustice and a huge environmental impact. But also because in the beginning, when Liliana invited me, we started talking about decentering. I think a lot of the discussion about technology and how it's affecting us, it goes back to lithium, which is extremely interesting, and it's interesting for me as well. I'm coming from Chile, which we also have huge lithium mines, and there is also an interesting political debate. We had a president that was one of the biggest businessmen, and in his thinking, we have lithium, the moment is now, because electric cars seems to be the solution. Chile should export it all because it's the right time. We don't know if after they're going to invent another battery and then lithium won't be needed. And this year we got another president elected. He's my age, and he has a completely different vision. His vision is, until we don't secure that the environment is not severely being affected and that the communities around are safe, we're not exporting even a gram of lithium. That's the discourse. We're going to see what happens. But yeah, it's a really relevant discussion. However, I also think a lot, and what I see when my students investigate this, it always go back to exclusively lithium. And I want to show you now, it's like there's like a broad range of other problems with this techno solution. And I'm going to bring it again back to surface. A lot of these electric cars, batteries, are also using rare earth metals that you can see here in the periodic table. They occur in a very low concentrations and in geological formations. They oxidize super quick, so they're very polluting, and they're very difficult to refine and costly to extract. Each electric car has roughly about a kilogram of this magnet that needs this rare metal to work. And 30% of this is actually this rare earth metal. And there are many, many of these mines, especially in China. Nickel is becoming another huge problem. Recently I was reading this news from The Guardian. So here a citizen was really thinking how the reality, and that's why in the bottom I put some quotes, is so contrasting to these showrooms of this fossil fuel free travel. So he was saying, we want clean and safe water, we're afraid the seawater was not muddy and not red yet, people could still fish in front of the houses. Cobalt is another huge, huge problem, and that relates a lot to our phones and the new iPhones. It is uniquely harvested in Congo, and more than anything, they use kids. So recently there was in the US a lawsuit because of this reason for Apple and Google. So as you can see, to respond to this, design cannot respond just with a techno fix. It should be responding to problems that are complex, social, cultural, environmental, economic, and also political. I also wanted to mention something about aesthetics, and this is a quote from Paola Antonelli. And she said, we always feel that for design to be ethical or responsible, we have to sacrifice something. Usually, the something is sacrificed is the sensuality or the elegance, but that is not true. And I think a really nice example is this Forma Fantasma desk made of e-waste. And this is something that I also am working now at the moment. I'm doing a residency at the Design Museum, and we're doing a speculative project about restore. So I'm working with architects, fashion designers, and also MA fashion students. And when we start envisioning how do we want this ecological future, because it's going to be highly speculative, we all agree, no beige, please. And then I started adding notes of like, why not? Beige is violently neutral, luxury is beige, and then this is really interesting because when I was having the meeting, one of my collaborators worked at Louis Vuitton, so I'm using his mind, but to do something completely not, and he was wearing all beige. So it was so funny. And then comfort is beige, beige is an anti-extravagant color, and beige is lifeless. And then one of my students is working in a future inhabitant, so she calls herself inhabitant fashion designer. And she said, identity is a multi-layered and complex, something a beige color palette does not express. In rejecting a generalized perception of luxury and modernity as beige, we present a multi-layered and varied palette, representing complex beings with complex problems to solve. And I want to end now my part with some examples that I think they're really nice, and I think they exemplify different visions and how design, taking very different lenses, can be really beautiful, can help communities, can restore ecosystems, and can shed light to the future. This project is by Cooking Section, is Isle of Skye. What they did is they arrived to this place in Scotland where it was hugely affected by salmon industry. So what they do is we need to change the consumption of salmon and change what we eat from salmon-based to regenerative aquaculture. And for this, what they created was an apprenticeship with the local school to find alternative ingredients that they could farm here. And then they also create a replacement with a project called Climbabor. So basically, here you see some tables, and here you will understand better. These tables, when the tide was low, it was a dining table to bring the community together and rethink the diet. And then when the tide was high, this table became the home for oysters, mussels, and seaweed, which are filtering water and are native from the region. And then what they did is they changed the diet of the locality, helped a lot with the environmental damage, but also took it back to London, and they managed with another project, which was also really well done and extremely beautiful, also mentioning how salmon is tainted. So they did like a really nice visualization of the problem, and they managed to remove salmon, everything from Tate, and not only from Tate, then now you go to other places and you also have Climbabor project in place. So they're designers, they're architects actually. They did a beautiful installation, brought people together, but actually the environmental consequence, I think it's pretty big. This is another project, and maybe I show this because sometimes students have more like a lens of graphic design. So I think that's also an interesting thing that also we explored this week with Felipe when we were doing our workshop, and it's from Something and Son, and it's a walking project called What Is, What Could Be. And these were a series of walks organized by the Design Museum where they explored how can we reimagine a more equal relationship between nature and cities. This is from Studio Swine, it's called Seacher. And this project is really nice. They went in a boat with a very, very simpler machinery called Nadler, which you can see in the bottom. This is a hand-powered water pump and sluice that sorts the microplastic grinding and uses a flotation tank to separate materials by density. So it's extremely analog and very, very simple. And they recollected all these microplastics and created several stools in a place where they recollected the microplastic. And now each of these really nice chairs has the name of the precise of this location. This is from Simon Starling. It's called Rift Valley Crossing. He constructed this canoe from all the magnesium extracted from the Dead Sea, which is one of the most has the most highly concentrated minerals. And then with the same canoe, he crossed from Israel to Jordan. Then I always like to show some material approaches, but they're really, really, really beautiful. This is from Tino Subert, The Color of Air. He collected all this particular matter carbon from car exhaust, and he created this fabric dye, pencil lead and printing ink. This is from Forma Fantasma. I guess you already saw what they're showing here. And basically, they developed this really nice volcanic ash glaze to replace silica, as now sand is being super overused, especially by construction. Another example, these are graduates from the RCA, and the team is very interesting. It's a team of 4. One is coming from business, one is coming from design, one is a chemist, and one is an engineer. And their project is set in the peatlands. The peatlands are the most effective carbon capturing element that we have in the world. It's not trees, even if you think every time you can offset is in forest. This is much more potent, and it's not only the most the source that captures more carbon. Also, for example, in the south of Chile, it also preserved mummies, so it's also heritage. And what is happening with global warming is these peatlands are being dried out. In London, also, people that make compost really bring mud, so they're also helping out the composting in London, but then they're drying out the most important carbon capturing natural technology, if you want to call it like that, that we have. So what they're doing is they're working in these peatlands with what they called experimental farmers. And what they do is they provide help by switching from drainage-based architecture to re-wet the peatlands. They help farmers to change the way they work, and then they recollect some species around these pits, and this has these structures that are really warm and very hydrophobic, so it's the perfect replacement for down or synthetic fillers. I've touched it because they sent me a sample, and it's extremely beautiful and warm. Now I'm working with them for the Design Museum too, so I've been trying on how does it feel to use this. This project is one of my students in one of my units, which I think it's also nice to show how a very speculative project can have a place and can make us think. She suggested that humans should hibernate in a biocapsule to enter to a nutrient restorative space while giving consumption a break for the planet. So she says most of the time we should actually be on sleep mode. In that way, stress levels and toxins will be eliminated. Vitals will return to the optimal capacities of a newborn as oxygen and other necessary particles are delivered to your organisms. And for this, she created a plant-based antimicrobial properties with different trees. So it would benefit the respiratory and the immune system. It's super, super speculative, but basically it was, what if we give the planet a break? And once we're giving a break, then the trees could take some things, we could remove our toxins, and we have a really nice system there. Another project is Pollinator Pathmaking from Daisy Ginsberg. In this project, one aspect is an installation with a real garden, but the main idea behind it is how can we create a garden, which are the species that we need for these pollinators to come here to attract. And for this, she also developed a website in which you can generate a planting scheme for appropriate local plants to bring the bees. And from AI, because that project is very, very beautiful, I will move to crochet, because a lot of people are into craft, and this is exactly what happened with these twins, Margaret and Christine Wertheim. They were trained in mathematics and love crochet, and because they're Australians, they were obviously super affected by the disapparition of the coral reefs. So they used their mathematical background to create a hyperbolic geometry and showed through crochet the diversity of the corals. And this is very approachable to people. Most of the people maybe won't see some very elevated exhibitions, but they're familiar with crochet. So that brought together a lot of people, and in this exhibition, they showed a huge, huge, huge variety of different species. So I think it's also really nice, and coming from some twins that had a background in mathematics, brought people together and show diversity. So it's really important that when we think about future practice in relation to design, we need to reestablish our relationships in the world. So some questions that I think they're important to pass to designers is, what do you want to make happen in the world? How and who are you considering? How generous towards the planet and its inhabitants? How are you creating more ecological lifestyle? How are you minimizing consumption of a natural resource? How are you questioning the way that things are currently put together? And the final one, I think it's really important, because it's basically, you need to rethink your discipline, but also you need to rethink yourself and the way we live. So what we need are really radical ways of ecological thinking that is not product-oriented, but a system way of ecological production. So for design, I think it's really important to address the material ethic of care, and also a critical sensibility for more informed discussion, as it cannot keep doing what it's been doing. So for this, we need to look for deeper environmental values, and also we need to think very consciously about every stage.
Thank you, Delfina. I think the richness of your presentation is really striking, even if I heard it this morning, and I'm enjoying even more now, so thank you so much. And I think there are so marvelous examples, also a variety of different approaches and responses of design towards the challenges raised by the Anthropocene. And you were mentioning care and the ethics of care. And indeed, I think it's really rich the way in which Maria Puig de la Pelacasa helps us to understand also the radical interdependency and to make it more tangible, and also to understand how to act within this framework. Because basically she sees care really as being this relationship of relationality between humans and more than humans agents, but also between humans amongst each other. And so really the point for her is, once you recognize this interdependency, you recognize that we are all interdependent from one another, you cannot but care. So it's not because you want to take an ethical decision, because you want to be good, but it's because you cannot do otherwise. It's a kind of rational choice. And I think that's really a strength in this point. And I think perhaps I want to read the quotation because I think it's really striking. And of course, she takes the idea of care from feministic studies from Tronto and Fisher, and I try to open up the idea of care and to open up the idea of politics towards also this idea of more than human agents. And so she said that care is everything that is done to maintain, continue, and repair the world so that all can live in it as well as possible. That word includes all that we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. And I think this idea that in nature, basically, we are sustaining one another and we are interacting with one another counters also a kind of dark thoughts about, that in nature there is only, like the Darwinian idea of the one against the other. It's more like the interaction which matters. And I think, what does it then mean to consider care? What does it mean to design like in this perspective of care or careful design? I think first of all, then it would mean to identify where there is need for care. And the need for care is mostly where we as humans have been with our anthropocentric choices, disrupting those interdependencies. So I think a first step that Maria Puig de la Bella Casa helped us to identify is the necessity to identify what went wrong. Where did we destroyed, those interdependencies, where we have been disrupting them. And a second step is, of course, then to identify what it takes then to weave back those interdependencies. What can be done to really care and thus to maintain, continue, and repair the world. And I think the examples that you have been showing, Delfina, really ties into this ability to represent, and make tangible, and also to generate alternative, to show alternative that can be very practical alternative, can be speculative alternative. And I've been working on Maria Puig de la Bella Casa and design for social innovation with Ezio Manzini in the past years. And indeed, we were thinking about how, to really design with care means, first of all, probably to be able to do a systemic reframing, right? So once you identify what needs to be done and what can be done, then you need to be able to question the systems, in which you design, to question how things relate to one another, and how can we perhaps shift, how can we change the systems in which we operate? So this is what we name an operation of systemic reframing. And looking into grassroots social innovation, I think there are marvelous examples of how grassroots social innovation really works to reshuffle and change the way in which we relate to one another. But I think this light is even more dear to me, because I think to really do that, you kind of need to address a serious operation of epistemological reframing. So you really need to question the kind of ontology you engage with, and you really need to embrace, in a certain way, relationality, because we need to counter, an anthropocentric framework of thinking that has been dominant for so many years, and that has been bringing us this idea of dichotomic thinking, bringing us a certain epistemological paradigm that we are, realizing was wrong. And what can we do then? Then we really need to reframe the way we think. And I think I want for a last time to come back to Arendt, because I think she shows us the way, in a sense, because she says that we need to think without the banister. We need to dare to step into the unknown. And when we have this moment of disbelief on tradition, and in our case, it's a moment of disbelief in the epistemological framework of the modern and its anthropocentrism, we need to be brave enough and to jump out literally of the banister. And of course, we need to do it probably in a more radical way, as Arendt herself was able to do in her time, because we really need to totally step beyond the banister of the modern. And somehow Arendt still uses some category of the moderns. We need to be even more radical than she was. And again, to be radical in the thinking and to critique a certain epistemological paradigm for designing, really, I think we don't need to look into social sciences. We don't need to look into philosophy. I think designing has in itself the ability to critique itself and to critique its anthropocentrism, to critique its way for being a tool for the futuring, and therefore to develop a self-critique. A self-critique which is dialectical. And here I like to come back to another philosopher who was contemporary of Hannah Arendt, which is, if you can come back very quickly to the previous slides, because the philosopher, which is Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno, because Adorno speaks about dialectics as an ability, of rationality to develop a self-critique of rationality as such. And I think here we need to basically do the same. We need to be able to develop a self-critique of design from within design. And I think design has this ability, so this dialectical ability. And in this sense, I think design can work as a sort of operational critique. So a critique which is able to critique itself, but also to critique the epistemological paradigm to which we stem, and to be able to translate this into action. And indeed, this might really mean to engage then in a sort of double movement, right? So on the one side, to engage with a critical moment, which is critiquing the epistemological framework from which we move, and critique designing from within this epistemological framework. So it's a self-critique. But on the other side, we also need to be operational. We need this critique to not be sterile. Otherwise, we just mimic a certain idea of critique in social sciences. So I think the way in which we can be critical as designers, it's really by pointing towards something different. It's about being, like generative and engage with alternatives, engage in this way with regenerative practice. So those two moments are not two different moments, but are two different part of the same movement, of the same dialectical movement that can lead us designers to self-critique a certain way of intending design and point towards alternatives. And I think, and this is the next slide, please, this is perhaps also something that I recognize in Donna Haraway even, because when she talks about being critical or critical theories, and then she talks about building meanings and bodies that have a chance for life, I think she also addressed this potential of critique of being transformative and regenerative towards reality. And of course, and here we can go to the next slide. Of course, I think this is probably also what Tony Fry refers to when he says that to acknowledge destruction doesn't diminish action, but lead us to material ethics. And thank you, Delfina, because you were the one providing me this morning with this quote. And I think here there's the same attention of, like being able to critique and to be able to acknowledge the destruction that we brought as designer, but without being overwhelmed by pessimism, and being able yet to envision for ourselves a possibility for being a form of material ethics. And I was struggled by his idea of material ethics. And then I thought about this ethics of care that Maria Puig de la Bella Casa speaks about, because it's really a form of embodied situated ethics. She talks about creating touching visions of the future as a possibility for working in a radical and yet regenerative way. So perhaps indeed what we are aiming here at is really like engaging with different paradigm of thinking, and perhaps embracing, I think Donna Haraway generates a wonderful framework for imagining our form of knowledge produced, our discourse produced as designer, as a form of situated knowledge that dares to be embodied, plural, pluriversal, processual, frail, fallible. So we shouldn't be afraid of fail. And I think here is the whole lesson of Donna Haraway that you were referring to, Delfina, of, stay with the trouble. Don't try to avoid it, and yet being propositive, and yet engage oneself in this operational form of critique. And indeed, and this is really like my very last slide, I think that designing in dark times, there is not one way to imagine this, but many multiple, plural, open, embodied, and situated way to experience that, and to experience how to be critical in a generative, affirmative way that opens up possibility for the futures. And opening up possibility for the futures, of course, as also Tony Fry says, it's probably the only way also for really being concrete in rethinking and reacting in the present.
So yeah, I want to finish the presentation with the fact that it's really important to make this uncomfortable ecological question, because this really opens design opportunities that have formed to give alternative futures. Thank you. Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you, Delfina and Virginia, very much for this, for your perspectives and the examples that you gave. I have several points and several questions, but we don't have too much time. I never like to say this, but it's true. So I would like to open very quickly to the public. So if you have comments, questions, just let me know. Perhaps just to give a little bit of space of reflection and of organizing the ideas. I would just say one or two things that is somehow I was connecting the examples that you gave with this image of the week of the fireflies that Virginia gave us. And you spoke about fireflies, a kind of light, when you were speaking about these dark times as times of possibilities, and you also spoke as a kind of weak light. But when I listen to Delfina examples, even if perhaps they are still not the mainstream practices, because mainstream practices are still quite degenerative. And just as a side note, the Daniel Wall's book about regenerative design is published in Portuguese in Bambual Editora. So if someone wants to know more, can go into it. So even if they are fireflies or still small lights, I think they are not weak. They are really they really present a kind of strength and so just to leave this idea. And Virginia, when you were speaking about I need to look here. Where did I? Cosmopolitical. This idea of cosmopolitical and intersection between a modern human life. I was thinking about another philosopher that I'm working with, that is Tenetem Tuambona. He speaks about we shall not say ecocide, we must say cosmocide, because it's a kind a larger destruction than what is pointed by ecocide. But well, if you want to comment on this, you can, but now I will give the word to the public. If there is questions, comments, or something.
I can add to what you just said. I think that cosmocide makes complete sense. This is also something that we were talking in the workshop, but even the idea of Mars is the colonization of Mars. So it's already coming with a colonizer, and that's in our language, we colonized Mars, we colonized the moon. So it can only perpetuate And yeah, that's
an extension of old practice.
Exactly. But that's why I think, and maybe this I come back to design. When I did my PhD, I had a classmate, Tibor, who was working in NASA. He was senior designer in NASA. When he was like, 56, he decided to go to London and do like a PhD. And then he finished it, but now he's back in NASA. So yes, going through all these critical lenses, being immersed, then this person actually maybe has an impact in all this, who knows, colonization. There's another designer that is also working now in also with NASA, doing everything about health. And she's also coming with this kind of critical lens. So again, as you say, this flickering.
Yes.
But again, it's very problematic how we do refer when we reach out other countries, because other celestial bodies, because it's coming with this problem from the very inception of it.
Yes. There, Mariana has a question. There is a microphone, so.
Thank you both. It was really wonderful to hear to the both of you speak today and open up all of these exciting ideas about alternative futures. I wanted to ask you, because you're both educators, and I really enjoyed hearing Delfina talk about this idea of unlearning, right? Or going through this process of unlearning when a student arrives at university and has to kind of get rid of all of these preconceptions about what the designer can do or should do. And I wanted to ask you particularly about the savior complex of design, and how do you, if you have any tips about how to unlearn it, because when we expose a scenario like this of the cosmocide, as you just said, in a way, in design, that could be seen as the formulation of a problem which one has to solve. And so, I wanted to ask you about that. Thank you.
Yes, but I think, sorry.
Do you want to start, Virginia?
Yes, I can perhaps start. First of all, hi Mariana, nice to see you. And it's really funny that you're asking this, because I just wrote an interview, and it was Ezio Manzini, myself, and Emanuele Quinz was interviewing us. And that was really my point, that I think there's a problem there, right? Because we are so much still seeing, like this problem-solving spectrum of the story. Why, to me, designing is more raising questions. Right? It's that's why perhaps I see also a connection with philosophy, right? Because basically we are doing the same but with different means. And I think this emphasis or overemphasis on the solutionist, right? The designer as a solutionist, having the trick to solve things and to change the world, and even now facing the Anthropocene, if we could, be the one solving things. I think it's more, that's why I like this opening up towards questioning epistemological framework and be very modest in what we can do. And my flickering light, I think my reference was to Pasolini, of course, and the fact that it's not that we can imagine that the knowledge that we are building, it's creating like a new body of knowledge, and that this becomes, what design should be. But it's more like that I think we should just self-critique ourselves and do a little operation of kenosis, so of acknowledgement of, there is just so much we can do, and yet do it, and without having the ambition to solve things. And I think this embracing other kind of epistemological paradigm can help us also to acknowledge that it's not that even if by coincidence something gets fixed throughout our work, it's always something very temporary, something very fragile, something very open that can change throughout time. And so it's not in our control, right? It's not in our hands. And I think Bruno Latour speaks about engendering. I think this is a concept also that helps in order to see how, we are just part of a bigger system, and we can just perhaps move something or question something, but there's just so much we can do. And I really I don't think we should use the word solutions or we should speak about solving things or problems, or I think we should really revisit the vocabulary we use and be more consistent. Also the word sustainability raises questions, as Delfina was mentioning. So in this sense, I think it's an healthy operation, to revisit our way of thinking and the words we use, and we need to do it, each of us individually, I think, from the place in which we are, but also collectively by engaging in conversation as we are doing this evening, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Virginia, and also I think it's really important to start changing language. My reply, I think it's going to come between the fact that I was trained in biology. So it's a very different way of understanding systems where you were formed having ecology, that when designers, and I look at it, the way that they simplify the phenomenon, still being overwhelming. So in my teaching practice, I've been through many failures, because sometimes I give these briefs that are highly complex, and one of them, I think you, Felipe, were also teaching that. It was map out, and I called constellation, going back to the cosmos side, all the socio-ecological and political issues around a material. And then you start mapping out and you end up with a huge problem. And that obviously resulted in a huge paralysis, that students could not see how they could possibly get out of this. But then maybe going back to what Daniel was saying about localism, whenever you have a precise context, and this is, we need to bring us down from the abstract mega problem, you will see, as I told you, an intervention point. You don't have to, and again, it goes back to language, solve the cosmocide. But there's so many things that you could intervene, but students cannot intervene when they're in this, between a highly complex mapping of problems and between the reference, they see, it happens to me, I'm in an MA, and they see Netflix, they see a story about fishing, conspiracy, and they bring this and they do not have a critical thinking. It's a generation that has a lot of references. Internet is there to do quick searches, plus they have Netflix and documentaries. So I do think it's important also to make them do a little bit more rigorous research, because otherwise they carry all this fast media. But then after they do a relevant research, and that comes with embedding critical thinking, because learning, you receive people from industrial design who never thought critically about anything. So that's what you get, and in a couple of months, you need to make them understand how to do rigorous research, then you need to allow them to start thinking in a critical manner, to then tell them you can actually intervene in a non-solution. So it's a lot what's going on, and it's not easy. And often many students cannot see it. You wish that they live back home with something in the back of their minds. And many students do something really amazing, and it becomes a really wonderful thing that now we have in the world. But it's not easy, and it's very paralyzing. But I think the only way out is with specific context. Otherwise, it's going back to Tony Fry, too vast and too complex.
It's overwhelming. Somehow.
Very overwhelming, yes.
We have time for one more question. It's André, please. Yes, but if there is something more that it's quite moving here in another person, please let me know. Otherwise, André, it's here. Yes.
Well, it's not a question, more a comment. Thank you a lot to both. Both were very complimentary and amazing. But my comment is about Hannah Arendt, exactly, because there is a concept in Hannah Arendt I'm very sensitive to it. The concept of alienation of the world. She develops this concept, alienation of the world, in contrast with alienation of, the Marxist concept of alienation of the subject. And when she talks about alienation of the world, I believe she's giving us a very good framework for an ecological reading. And most of it in direction with what Virginia told here about the disconnection between politics and us, and yeah, I believe she gave us somehow a beginning for thinking, yes, and the idea of natality is very important as well, because and I believe it's important especially for the domain of design, because design is at the beginning of something. We first design something, then we have the product, and she put her key moment of politics in the birth, not in the hand, not in the death. Quite the opposite of what is usual in philosophers. It's just a comment. I enjoy a lot. Thank you.
I mean, I think it relates a lot, because that same birth that you mentioned is so important. Whenever you do these more ecological briefs, and the word that I use to my student is think it from the inception. Otherwise, you will just be carrying out or trying to solve. But if it's well framed from the beginning, because that birth is really important. So it makes complete sense to me.
Okay. I think that we'll need to stop now. Virginia, would you like to say something also?
I just think that we could keep on talking,
yes,
but probably we'll find another way to continue the conversation. But it was marvelous to be part of this. Thank you so much.
I think that Delfina, because she's here, and we'll move now to concerts, and there is a program that we will be able to continue discussing in a more informal way. Virginia, I hope that we can do it in another occasion. So thank you very much, and I think this idea of birth for the beginning of the program of talks was very good also, so thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you for the invitation, Liliana.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Virginia.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.